Welcome to the Feeling Loudly podcast, a show about the power and magic of emotion, explored through the lens of astrology, divination, and art. I'm your host, Jana. I'm an astrologer, a tarot reader, Akashic Records reader, poet, and witch, and I'm here to help you feel your feels. Hello, humans. Welcome to Tarot Tuesday. I let out many curse words when I saw our card of the week because I don't know, y'all. If you've been listening to these episodes, we've had literally all of the pips, all of the minor arcana have been swords, and the sword suit is just rough. And I mean, it's, it has many gifts, but it's also rough. It's a rough journey. And so we've had some tough ones too. And I just think it's so interesting that we're leading with swords. Before I get into it, as usual, you can become a patron to support this podcast and support my work as a creator. You can find the link down below. My tiers are shifting on the 6th, which is how many days from now? 3 days from now. So it's on the new moon in Gemini. And so if you do want to get in at my current rates for Patreon, I would do that nowish when you're listening, if you're listening to this before the 6th. Otherwise, I will be rolling out my new tiers with new prices, and the moon and rising tiers will get a couple little new perks on the new moon, and the prices are going up by like a few dollars, or maybe it's $5 for the rising tier. It'll be from 22 to, I can't even remember my prices. Check back in with me later. I think that's kind of reflective of our card. So let's just get into it. Anyway, you can go find my links if you want to do that stuff. Our card of the day today is the 9 of Swords, and this is actually a Gemini card. It's Mars in Gemini, and today is our Venus Cazimi in Gemini, Venus conjunct the Sun in Gemini, and Jupiter conjunct Mercury in Gemini. And Jupiter just entered Gemini, and so there's a lot of Gemini in the sky and a lot of mental stuff going on for probably most of us. If you've been feeling like your head is all over the place, like you're changing your mind constantly, like you're trapped in cycles of thinking and having trouble making a decision, or just identifying your next steps and getting out of analysis paralysis, then you are not alone. That's very much the vibe right now. And whenever Jupiter enters a new sign, since it happens once a year, it's a pretty big shift. Like, this Jupiter in Gemini so far has been really noticeable for just about every astro attuned human that I've spoken to. A lot of people are questioning their relationship to being very online. A lot of people are just questioning a lot of things, which is like very Geminian, to ask a lot of questions and sort of like get curious about what we may have taken for granted or just kind of like accepted as a truth. Gemini is a sign that brings us into nuance, sometimes to a fault. Like, we might not be able to land on an answer or make a decision because we can just see so many possibilities. And that's all the more true with Jupiter in Gemini, since Jupiter has this expansive energy where it kind of blows up the energy of the sign that it's in. And so moving out of Taurus and into Gemini is a pretty radical shift from fixed earth into mutable air. So if you're noticing this real shift into the intellect and into the mind and tossing around a lot of ideas and thinking a lot of thoughts and maybe like needing to find ways to cool your brain off, I would really recommend seeking out meditative activities that feel good for you. I always say that like meditation doesn't have to be sitting on a cushion. It can be going for a walk in nature without your phone. It can be breath work. It can be movements. It can be practices like art practices, like painting. Like free writing is a really great Jupiter and Gemini exercise. Like writing just stream of consciousness for like 5 minutes a day, or doing morning pages. Like, all of these activities can be really powerful ways to harness the power of this transit and to also cool your mind off and to kind of give it some space. This is relevant to this episode, I promise, and that's why I'm leading with it, is that, I was talking, I've told a few people about this, that I wasn't talking to anyone. I was talking to myself. And I realized that like when I have trouble meditating, often it's because I'm filling my mind with a bunch of junk throughout the day. And then when I sit down to meditate, all I can do is think because I haven't had my thinking time. And so having your thinking time is a good sort of like remediatory action to take during Gemini season and for the next year with Jupiter and Gemini, because it's likely your thoughts are just maybe louder, or maybe there are more of them. You're having more thoughts, a lot of thoughts, all the thoughts, and needing to give yourself time to think without jamming your mind full of content and full of other people's opinions and full of podcasts and books and all this stuff. I mean, you can keep listening to my podcast, but obviously, but like it can be a time where we might hunger for a lot of information, but having so much information can really dilute our own thoughts and our own wisdom. So just trying to find kind of a balance and remembering that you're unlikely to find it right away. You're unlikely to find it this Gemini season with all of these planets in Gemini. Maybe if like you're really like, I was about to say well endowed with Gemini in your chart. Maybe if you have Gemini placements already, you've already kind of like found your flow with this. But for people who don't, or for people who are struggling, just remember that like the astro weather is kind of supporting that struggle in this moment, and it's maybe showing you the areas where you could use some more balance and some more boundaries. And when this Geminian energy cools off and we move into Cancer season and beyond, you'll likely feel a lessening of the intensity of that, and that'll be the time to kind of like maybe put some more practices in place, or it'll just be easier probably to uphold your boundaries, especially with like content and being online and all of that stuff. Okay, so that gets us to the Nine of Swords. The Nine of Swords is a card that I often associate with anxiety, often with intrusive thoughts, the thoughts that keep us up at night, fears. It can be sort of like a paranoia card where we might like think so negatively that we even at times might end up sort of like manifesting that reality. And I say that with a lot of caution, to be honest, because as someone who myself has struggled with intrusive thoughts for a long time, I have a family history of diagnosed OCD. And if you listen to my podcast and know me as a person, you know I hate the DSM. And so I don't like heavily identify with diagnoses, with mental health diagnoses, but like as a catch-all term, you could say that I'm a person who, if I were to go see a psychiatrist, would probably be diagnosed with OCD. Not because I demonstrate the like, repetitive behaviors and stuff like that, but intrusive thoughts, obsessive thinking, hyper focus on a particular outcome that I might be afraid of, and stuff like that has been a very good friend of mine and a very familiar friend of mine for a long time. And I also used to struggle with the more compulsive behaviors and still do at times. And that's something that will be kind of like a red flag that goes off for me, that shows me that I'm needing support if I start like engaging in more compulsive behaviors. So the Nine of Swords is a card and an energy that I'm really familiar with. And the reason I say that I introduce the idea of like negative thoughts manifesting very cautiously is that that is something that scared the shit out of me when I first heard it. When I first got into like the spiritual world and heard people talking about like where the attention goes, the energy flows, and like don't focus too much on negative outcomes because they might end up becoming a reality. For someone who had so much fear already associated with my thinking patterns, that really sent me to a bad place at times. And I really like kind of spiraled a few times thinking that my negative thoughts were going to manifest. And then that just caused me to think and focus on them even more. And so I just want to like put that out there. If anyone else who's listening to this struggles with that type of pattern, big hugs, first of all. Like, you're not alone at all. There's so many of us who deal with that. And it's something that I think we don't necessarily talk about enough, that like this is, our minds can be a really scary place. And, you know, people on the internet talk about it all the time. But like, I think it's something that in our day to day, especially like 3D relationships, offline relationships, maybe doesn't get enough airtime, is just how scary our minds can be and how overwhelming it can be to try to navigate the terrain of your mind when you're the only one in there, except the other voices in your head and accept like the other versions of you and the other parts of you that might speak up, the other voices that might pull you this way and that. And it can feel like there is a whole family inside of us. And as a parts work practitioner and someone who's trained in internal family systems, that is something that I subscribe to, is the idea that there is like a whole family of parts within us that operate and that might speak over each other and that might have unseen needs and unmet desires that cause them to act out within us. And so that in itself can be a very Nine of Swords experience, is when we feel like so pulled in different directions that we might get stuck. We might feel completely immobilized and uncertain of which direction to take and fearful about the outcomes that we might experience. And it can also even be associated with like feelings of guilt or shame that sort of plague us and that keep us really fixed in place in self-loathing and in even states of like denial. And all, like, think of like the really scary shit that happens in a human brain. Like, that isn't often a Nine of Swords experience. And it's really painful stuff. And it often comes from early experiences or from ongoing trauma and even abuse in many cases, that leads us into a place where it's a really hard place to be, where the mind is a really hard place to be. And the stuff that I mentioned at the top of the episode about like Jupiter and Gemini and these meditative practices and all of that can be a really beautiful coping mechanism and a way to establish a safer relationship with your mind, especially if you're someone who has intrusive thoughts or, you know, I'm making a connection now to the Oracle card that we pulled out. And so before I go any further, I just want to like put a trigger warning out there, and I'll put this in the show notes and in the Instagram caption too. There will be mentions of self-harm and mentions of trickier material like that on here. So if that's stuff that is potentially going to activate you, please don't keep listening. Please just pause and save it for the future when you feel more grounded or not at all. If that's a topic that is very upsetting for you or something that you've experienced or struggled with yourself and you think that this might upset you, please don't continue listening. For those of you who are comfortable thinking about these topics and want to go further, let's go. So our Oracle card is Ideation. And when I first saw this come out, I did not at all make the connection to suicidal ideation, but then I almost said the words out loud, and then I looked down and was like, oh shit, okay, there we go. Ideation. Suicide and like the idea of ending your life can be a Nine of Swords experience. It's the concept that like we get so deep into ourselves and into our pain that it's very, very hard to retrieve ourselves or even to be retrieved by other people. And when you've experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of pain in your life and you reach the point where you're seriously considering like maybe just ending my life is the best option here, that itself, that contemplation can be a Nine of Swords experience. And for some people, it is an intrusive thought and it's not something that they would act on. For other people, obviously it is, and it can lead to that experience. And I do not say that to suggest that that's what the Nine of Swords always means by any stretch of the imagination or even often, but it's where we're being led today into the fact that like the concept of suicide and the concept of self-harm of any kind can be something that comes from the plague of repetitive, anxious, fearful, traumatic thoughts. I was watching Outlander the other day. I did a little co-watch with a friend, and I've already seen the whole show. I've probably talked about it on this podcast before because I was obsessed with it in the winter and I watched the entire series. So I just watched like one random episode in season 6 this weekend. And no spoilers, but there is a period of the season where Claire is having hallucinations and experiencing intrusive thoughts, and she turns to ether, which is like, what do you call the people who put people under for surgery and all that? I'm completely spacing on what it's called. Oh my God, this is gonna drive me bonkers. Whatever the people who put you under, who give you the good stuff and put you under, she like creates that and then ends up taking that because it's the only way that she can stop these intrusive thoughts and these visuals that she's getting. And that to me is a 9 of Swords experience. Having hallucinations, even like magical thinking could be a component of this, and experiences that really kind of lead us out to sea and cause us to reach toward often substances or things that distract us or things that temporarily quell our pain. And so one thing that's coming to mind is that often isolation can breed these experiences because we end up in a sort of echo chamber within our own minds, and that can get very, very loud when we just have our own thoughts to keep us company. I, as a 12th house person and as someone who like hermits quite a bit and doesn't have a whole lot of people locally, and that's been the case for me for years now because I've moved around a lot. I have gone through periods, especially during early pandy days, where I got so lost in my mind that I thought I was going insane. Like I had an experience in 2020 in the spring that was, I think I've talked about this on here too. Whenever I come upon like oh no, I have to introduce something that's traumatic, I'm like, oh, I realize I've already talked about that on here. So I guess this is just a public diary at this point. But yeah, anyway, I had a very, very difficult mental health experience in like leading into the lockdown. Like I was already in a really not good place. And then when lockdown began, it was even worse. And of course, like, you know, it was true for a whole bunch of people. So I'm not going to like exaggerate my experience here, but I had a shit time. It was really hard and I was alone in my apartment and I was very alone with my thoughts for months at a time, coming off of like plant medicine ceremonies that like really knocked me into a very tenuous place. And I was having 9 of Swords experiences. I was having extreme fear and anxiety, in relationships specifically, and some of that was real and some of it wasn't. Some of it was a huge, like, I don't know, I'm not going to call it an exaggeration, but it was like kind of like a Jupiter and Gemini experience where a seed was planted and then it expanded to be so large that it was like this huge balloon of fear that I was out of control. And I got back to stability, but being in isolation during those months, paired with having taken, you know, this heavy duty psychoactive plant medicine and paired with already being depressed and anxious and going through a health crisis was a really tricky combination for me. And so, and then being in a very unhealthy relationship at the time that was triggering these fears, among other things. So that to me was sort of like the epitome of a 9 of Swords experience. I had mental health challenges in the past. I'd been depressed and anxious, and I'd gone through difficult phases, but that was the most acute episode of any kind that I've ever experienced, because I've never gotten to the point before where I thought I was maybe losing my mind. And that's where I got. I felt like I was having a psychotic episode, but at the same time, I was going through this like spiritual awakening. And if you've been through similar experiences, they're common, let me tell you. They are so, so common, and people just don't talk about them because people don't want to seem crazy. But a lot of us have experiences where when we're coming into new perspective and we're growing psychically and spiritually and emotionally, we have experiences that crack us open so wide that we lose track of ourselves and we have trouble grounding. And that's very much where I was at. I was doing this heavy duty trauma work in therapy, and then I was going into these plant medicine ceremonies and doing this incredibly deep, like soul excavating work. And I was having all of these, like external inputs that were complicating that at the time, because we can't live in like we can't block out the world. And that was a hectic time to have that going on. And so I bring this up in part because I think like it's tricky and there's no clear answer. There would be if you were to turn to like some mental health professionals, and they could call pretty much any spiritual awakening like a psychotic episode because they look very similar on the surface, and often, again, they occur simultaneously. And if I can find this episode of Ghost of a Podcast where Jessica Lanyadoo talks about this, I will drop the link below. If I remember correctly, she did an episode about spiritual awakenings and psychosis. It was within like the last 3 years, so I'll search the archives and see if I can find it. But it's right, it's so common, and it's difficult if you don't have people around you who can help you ground and who can also honor the reality you're experiencing without enabling like paranoia and without enabling delusion. And so it's hard, right? And like one of the lessons I think that many of us face during phases like this is that we need to cultivate healthier boundaries with our own minds. And one of the biggest ways to do that is through mindfulness practices and through grounding practices and through cleansing practices. But not everyone has access to that information, and not everyone has access to teachings. A lot of people might go through portals of spiritual awakenings not quite understanding what's happening. And in fact, I would say probably that's the case for most people. I don't think most people go through a transformative spiritual experience and are completely cognizant of what's going on. Like often you feel like you are being shat out of a black hole by the universe, and you feel like you're like going through the birth canal, and it can be very much like a chrysalis experience, or like the hanged one in the tarot, where we're so tightly bound up that we can't see around us. We might not even be able to turn our neck if we're in the cocoon, and we can only like try to be still with what's happening and try to be still with the discomfort and have it teach us and have it work on us until we're ready to come out of that cocoon transformed. And then that in itself is like a radical process. Like, now you're born, oh my God. And so like most of us, I think, who are engaging in like spiritual development of any kind or like whatever, most of us have these experiences like ongoing. It's not like a one and done thing. You don't ascend. Like, it's not like, oh, you've made it, you're enlightened. Like, that's not the reality. Like, as humans, we go through ongoing experiences of transformation, and often they bring us to the brink. Maybe that's not true for everyone, but dude, I mean, it's been true for me. Every awakening process I've gone through has involved pretty much like intense experiences that kind of like shook me. And in that way sort of acted as tower experience or tower moments too, that felt like really upheaval and felt like whether it was external or internal or often both. So tying this back into the Nine of Swords, I don't know, where should we go from here? Do we have advice? I kind of want to turn to our song, which I think is so freaking beautiful for this topic. It's Just For Now by Image. It's Just For Now by Imogen Heap, which is such a classic at this point. Reminds me of like, this must have been middle school or maybe high school for me. Let me pull up the lyrics and I will read them to you. I'm sure most people have probably heard this song. It'll be linked below if you want to listen. So she says, just for now, just for now, just for now, and sings it a bunch of times. And then goes into sort of like a story. And so to orient you to this before I actually read the lyrics, this song is about the holidays. It's about being at a holiday gathering of some kind, probably with family. And it's a very like complicated experience, as holidays and family gatherings often are for like the vast majority of us, I think. And we see this reflected in the sort of dialogue that's going on throughout the song from different perspectives. So it starts off, it's that time of year, leave all our hopelessness aside. If just for a little while, tears stop right here. I know we've all had a bumpy ride. I'm secretly on your side. How did you know it's what I always wanted? Could never have too many of these. Will you quit kicking me under the table? I'm trying. Will somebody make her shut up about it? Can we settle down, please? So we have that dialogue of like, as if someone's kicking someone under the table and like, oh my God, you got me what I always wanted, opening gifts, etc. And then it goes back into, it's that time of year, leave all our hopelessness aside, if just for a little while, tears stop right here. I know we've all had a bumpy ride. I'm secretly on your side. Bite tongue, deep breaths, count to 10, nod your head. This example of trying to cope and trying to like stay calm in a really activating and uncomfortable situation. I think something is burning. Now you've ruined the whole thing. Muffle the smoke alarm. Whoever put on this music, better quick, sharp, remove it. Pour me another. Oh, don't wag your finger at me. And then it repeats the, I don't know what you call it, but it's that time of year bit. And then the song ends just by repeating over and over and over again, get me out of here. Get me out of here. Get me out of here. And so the whole setting is that she's at this family gathering and there's like this camaraderie and this love, but also obviously so much conflict and disorder and a feeling of chaos that you need to like soothe yourself through. And the ending here, get me out of here, is like wanting to escape what might feel like a prison of chaos, and probably a prison that activates a lot of like deep stuff. Like think about the parts of you that come out when you're at a family gathering and you start getting set off. Like I know that that's one of my least favorite versions of myself, is the myself that I see come out when I'm with my family and I start to get like really irritated or really like uncomfortable in some way, or angry or judgmental or whatever. It brings out this younger version of myself where I'm like, oh my God, like, please no, I thought we'd grown out of this. And it's hard, right? Like you come back as an adult self and you try to bring in like all of your coping strategies and all of those muscles of patience and empathy and boundaries that you probably work on in your life outside of those times. But then you go into it and it's like being like in the storm or like in the lion's den. Like suddenly the people who were probably like played a big role in some of your trauma potentially are surrounding you. And so I think that this is like a really interesting and pretty perfect metaphor for what can go on internally within us too, because the people in our lives, our family members, the people who have acted as the most like formative in our early life, whoever that is for you, they can become the voices in our head. They can become those internalized voices that end up feeding into our anxiety at times, or feeding into our fears, or our beliefs about ourselves that might be harsh or cruel even. And so I think that it's just so cool. I love when Shufflemancy does this. Like, I would not have thought to bring in this metaphor for the family that we're literally raised with, and then the family that lives on within us as an internal family system family. But it's so beautiful and it's so on point. And I think at times it can be really helpful when we're navigating experiences of anxiety and fear and guilt and shame and self-loathing to ask who's speaking. Like, are you familiar with this voice? Is this a voice that's making like a repeat appearance? Is this like a constant feature? Is this someone who's been with you for as long as you can remember? Is this a voice that feels new? Like, and does it resemble anyone from your actual life when this voice comes in? Can you trace it back to a potential source, or at least like an inspiration? And if we're to take the like less maybe heavy version of ideation here, I think that it would be that going into an experience of ideation, like as in literally ideating and like visioning what's possible, can be a way to help us self-soothe during experiences that are very Nine of Swords-esque. And so that might mean like considering other possibilities. Speaking of Jupiter and Gemini, what other possibilities exist? If you're having really difficult thoughts, maybe there are other options. Maybe there are positive outcomes, dare I say. Maybe things could actually go well. Maybe things could actually go well. Maybe things could be neutral. Maybe it could be like a shrug, as opposed to the worst case scenario. And so visualization is a really powerful technique, whether it's literally like calling in your mind's eye, or less visual, but more just like, imagining, however you imagine, however your mind works and however your little headspace works. Coming up with visuals and visions for the future can be a way to help combat the paralyzing nature of anxiety and fear. And it's something that I've used when I've been going into like difficult conversations at times, like visualizing the conversation going really well, visualizing my ideal outcome, or just visualizing myself navigating the situation really well no matter what happens. And if I do that, like with focus and presence right before a big conversation, it can totally shift the energy, because I'm approaching it with more optimism, with more openness, with more hope, and with more confidence. And it's sort of like a little, what's the thing? God, I can't think of words on this episode. On the Mercury-Jupiter conjunction to boot. I can't think of words, which is annoying. There are too many options. But, damn, what is it? I don't know. Someone tell me if you think of what I'm talking about. But it can help. It can help us like switch into this mind frame or this mindset that is oriented toward possibility and toward like lovely possibility. And that's a practice that we can apply more like future oriented when we do future visioning, which I've talked about on the podcast before, where we visualize a day in the life in the future and then like root ourselves in that with an affirmation that helps us hook into that future. And then we start making choices from that perspective as if we're already living that life. It's manifestation stuff. And so like, again, more stuff that I bring up with kind of like a warning label on it, because we can't manifest away a lot of the circumstances in our lives, but we can put ourselves in a different frame of mind, which changes a whole bunch of shit in our lives. And that may be simple, but it's not easy. It's simple to like see a possibility, but it's not necessarily easy to then stay open to that possibility or to actually entertain it, because those like tracks in our mind are often very well worn. And if you're someone who leans more into negative thinking or pessimism or cynicism, it's a difficult pattern to break at times. And it's totally possible, but it can be difficult. And I was thinking earlier today how like I don't have the science to back this up, but once upon a time I read some type of piece of writing or like a study or something that was about how it's actually an adaptive quality to be pessimistic and to be cynical. And there's a reason we have this sort of negative bias and an orientation toward the negative, and how our brains retain negative or like dangerous material for longer because it can be life-saving potentially. And it's a survival mechanism. It's like an adaptive quality that helps us cope with our reality by potentially keeping us out of harm's way. It's like when you see, if I see like a car that's driving like a little bit shakily and maybe veering, like I'm probably going to jump to the assumption that that's a dangerous driver. Maybe they're drunk. And in that situation, going to the worst case scenario can be really helpful. It can save your life. But in like an everyday situation where maybe you're having a conversation and someone's like voice is a little bit shaky, if you immediately jump to this person is like a deceptive liar, like can't be trusted, that might be a little bit less helpful. That might create a lot of problems, and that might be something that like that hypervigilance can potentially cause more harm than good, or do more harm than good. So I guess I say this in part to kind of like extend a hug and some understanding and some assurance that if you're someone who leans into negativity, that it might offer some relief to realize that there's probably like a survival reason for that. There's probably a very good reason that you think that way or that you see the world that way. And it's not helpful to beat ourselves up for negative thinking, or to beat ourselves up for being hypervigilant, or for being anxious, or for being, having a lot of shame. Like it's just piling onto the shame shit pile. When we do that to ourselves, it makes it much harder for us to move forward and to heal. And what can help us is compassion and grounding, and at times some like levity. Like I earlier today had a little anxious episode where I was starting to imagine these worst case scenarios, and I just started intentionally laughing. Like I was like, let me just laugh. Like, okay, so what if this does happen? Like, okay, great. Like that would kind of suck. But what if this happens? Oh, that would be better. And when I kind of like took that lighthearted approach and started like not investing so much in this really scary story, and instead backing out and seeing it through like some humor and kind of like laughing in the face of potential pain and being like, all right, you know what? Like if it happens, it happens. The thing is like, I'm going to be there for myself no matter what. No matter what happens, like I will make it through this, and I'll show up for myself, and I'll learn, and I'll move forward, and I'll like, look back on this and maybe laugh about it years from now. And so like, I think that that's not necessarily going to work for everyone. I'm looking at you, Virgo placements. That might not help. Maybe it will. I don't know. But it works for me and my brain, and it's very supportive for my Leo moon that like really appreciates humor and appreciates levity and laughter as a way to move through reality with less pain, or at least to like apply some balm, some soothing balm to our pain, is the medicine of laughter. and how sometimes Nine of Swords experiences have us so serious and like so fixated on a specific outcome that we see as horrible and scary that like we get very invested in it and very like, oh my God, this is what's gonna happen. And it can be powerful to back up and be like, all right, so then what? Haha. Like, all right, so if that happens, like, then what? Great. Okay, it happens. Like, so maybe we imagine it. Maybe we imagine it happening. And it's like, okay, that's not as bad as I thought it was. Or if it is, like, okay, that would fucking suck and I don't want that to happen. But, like, again, is there an assurance that you will be there for yourself through that? And so I guess that's where I want to end here tonight, is that I think one way to move through Nine of Swords experiences and to kind of like capture some of the medicine from them is to show yourself that you can show up for yourself. And showing up for yourself might be asking for help. It might be asking for someone else's perspective. It might be asking, ideally, someone that you like trust and respect that doesn't like fan the flames when you're experiencing like scary thoughts. Someone who can help you ground and kind of like diffuse that tension. Maybe it's a therapist. Maybe it's a grounded friend. Maybe it's someone who like doesn't feed into fear and can instead help like expand and help you see possibilities. And that might mean your journal. That might mean like taking it to a page and writing down what some of your fears are and then countering those with other possibilities. This is very like cognitively oriented stuff. And I mention it because it's Gemini season and because like this is an air card, a swords card. But as a Taurus person, as a very earthy and watery person, often the thing for me is to hold myself, like physically. Like I will place my hands on my body and I'll breathe into my hands and send love to the parts of myself that are experiencing a lot of fear. I will talk to those parts. I'll offer them reassurance. I will sit and breathe. I will like focus on doing some type of rhythmic breathing pattern that requires my focus so that I take my focus off of those scary thoughts for a little bit and tune into a soothing exercise that actually like calms my body. And I think like for those of us who lean more into the like cerebral, like overthinking patterns, the body is going to be the answer more often than not. And so those other things I mentioned, like countering your thoughts, it's kind of like CBT oriented stuff. Like, to be honest, that stuff doesn't super work for me. But what does work for me is going to the body and speaking to those parts that need support, reassurance, and love. And often for me, the love and the support that they need is I will be there for you no matter what. And what a like soothing and reassuring thing to hear from someone else too. I had a friend just the other day say like, I'll be here for you no matter what. And that was so supportive to hear. So supportive to hear that like someone will be there and I can reach out and I have this hand that's extended toward me and this heart that's extended toward me. And so not all of us have that. I feel very fortunate to have someone who will be there for me. I haven't always had that. And when I didn't have that, being there for myself in those ways and leaning into the practices that did ground me and support me, leaning into self-compassion, spending time in nature, finding ways to soothe and move through these challenging portals of scariness and overwhelm, is what helped me make it through. So I guess I'll leave it there. I know this was like kind of a hectic episode, but I hope it helps someone who might be going through a Nine of Swords experience, experiencing a lot of anxiety. I love you. Big hugs to you. You know, I know I mention Discord occasionally, but like we have a very loving group of people in our Discord, and we have a feels channel where we talk about our feelings and where you can just like share what's going on. And it's very non-judgmental. It's like a very compassionate space to be. And you can just air it out. Sometimes putting things in print can be really helpful. Just writing something out can kind of like diffuse the tension and the power of it. And you are totally welcome. It's a queer space, it's a leftist space, it's a radical space, and a place on the internet that I hope can act as a little cozy nook for those of us who need it. So that is available if you're in need of some community and some love. And if you do need support of some kind, I'm going to link a couple other resources down below. And I just hope that you are doing okay, and I'm sending you a lot of love. Bye, y'all.